When people hear the Old West, their brain immediately loads the Hollywood version. Dusty streets, piano music, two idiots staring at each other at high noon while the rest of the town hides behind barrels. Apparently, nobody has rules, nobody has manners, and everyone is waiting desperately for the government to show up and teach them how to be adults. That story survives because it's useful, not because it's true. The American West was dangerous, sure, but it wasn't dangerous because people rejected order. It was dangerous because everything was far away, mistakes were permanent, and help wasn't coming. And when you live in that kind of environment, you either figure things out quickly or you don't live very long. Welcome to our republic.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political band that kept
sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not one small step for man.
Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Now, let's all agree that the best shootout scene for two idiots standing in the street is Back to the Future 3. We can agree to disagree because I know I'm right. But yeah, there was crime in the West. Yeah, there was violence. No one is pretending it was a theme park, but the idea that the frontier was some nonstop collapse of civilization until a federal employee arrived on horseback is one of those myths that sounds about as smart. It sounds smart until you think about it for more than 10 seconds. Chaos is expensive. Chaos wrecks property. Chaos gets you killed. And most people, contrary to modern assumptions, actually prefer not to be killed. Settlers didn't move west because they wanted anarchy. They moved west because they wanted opportunity without being smothered by people who never set foot on land, telling them how to live on it. That meant freedom. Yes, but freedom with rules that they actually agreed to. So when there's so there wasn't a courthouse yet. But that didn't mean that they just shrugged and said, "Well, I guess we'll all just become criminals." They did handle it themselves. Mining camps are where this becomes painfully obvious. You dump thousands of men into the same area, all chasing the same shiny rocks, and somehow you're supposed to believe they all spent their time shooting each other instead of, trying to get rich. In reality, miners wrote mining codes almost immediately. They defined claims, set boundaries, and created rules for disputes because nobody wanted to spend their everyday fighting over dirt. Turns out even greedy people understand that constant violence is bad for productivity. And these rules weren't written by philosophers. They were written by tired, practical men who wanted to dig in peace without wondering if someone was going to come up and steal their claim while they slept. Cattle towns followed the same pattern. Ranchers formed associations, coordinated grazing, and settled disputes because unmanaged chaos kills cattle, destroys lands, and bankrupts everyone involved. Corporation wasn't some moral awakening. It was the cheapest option available. Order didn't show up because someone felt virtuous, right? Like riding it on a horse, pale rider. It showed up because disorder sucked ass. Now we get to the part where everybody suddenly gets nervous, right? Vigilance committees were not just book clubs. They weren't gentle. And no, they didn't get it right all the time. Justice without due process is fast, blunt, and sometimes wrong. It's not that controversial. It's just reality. But here's what usually gets left out. Vigilance committees didn't form because people loved violence. They formed because criminals figured out there were no consequences yet, and communities decided that experimenting needed to end immediately, right? Like the experiment of no law needed to end immediately. These weren't power grabs. They were stopgaps. And once courts and judges and actual law enforcement became available, most of these committees shut themselves down. They didn't cling to authority. They didn't reinvent themselves as permanent rulers. They went away because the job was done, which is not how groups behave when they're hungry for power. Okay, let's agree to that. When sheriffs and marshals finally arrived, they weren't walking cheat codes, right? They were often underpaid, outnumbered, and responsible for territories so large that backup was more of a suggestion than a plan, right? Their authority didn't come from the badge alone. It came from a community that believed they were legitimate. A sheriff who abused power or ignored local norms didn't last very long because enforcement without constant without consent, leads, tends to fail pretty quickly. And despite what movies insist on telling you, towns like Dodge City and Tombstone were not daily shooting galleries. Yeah, violence happened, but it wasn't the defining feature of everyday life. Most towns were boring, which is why Hollywood skips them. Boring, it turns out, is a sign of that order is working. If there was one thing the frontier Americans took seriously, it was property. This wasn't an abstract, theoretical way, but very practical, this keeps me alive way. Stealing a horse, you steal a horse, you don't just inconvenience someone, you might have killed them, take supplies, and you might doom an entire family. That's why punishments were harsh, not because people were cruel, but because reality was unforgiving. Rules existed to protect survival, not feelings. And that's why order held. People understood exactly what was at stake. As communities grew and stabilized, formal government eventually followed. Courts were established, judges appointed, and territorial laws written down. Most people welcomed it because predictable justice is better than improvising forever. But here's the part that almost never gets taught. Government didn't create order in the West. It formalized an order that already existed. The groundwork was laid by communities first. Authority showed up later and just put a seal on it. The sequence matters the sequence of that actually matters more than people like to admit. See, the American West proves something deeply inconvenient. People are capable of creating order without centralized control. Not perfect order, not a utopia, but functional, accountable order rooted in shared interests and consequences. This isn't socialism, right? This is, like we talked about before, a people able to govern themselves. Authority works best when it grows out of a people it governs, right? When it is imposed from a distance by people who've never lived with the results, it becomes fragile and resented. It was true then, and it hasn't changed. It just hasn't. The West wasn't saved by government writing in at the last second. Government is useless. Unless it's there, like I said, to put a seal on things that people have already put in place. It was built by people who refused to live without rules, even when no one was around to enforce them. Lawlessness existed for sure, but responsibility existed right alongside it. Chaos showed up, and corporation followed close behind. Order didn't require permission. It required adults willing to act like frickin' adults. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. A little bit of a different episode. Everyone just thinks the West was this crazy, wild place, but it was formed by communities, by people, Americans who were able to govern themselves. Remember, history isn't boring. It's the story of Americans repeatedly proving that order doesn't come from power. It comes from its people. We'll see you next time.